Hi, I'm Tracy Heuerman with GROWMARK, and with the early planting this year, I was hoping to not have to discuss this topic, but although we were able to get a lot of planting done, we still sit with some work left to do. So as we reach the latter part of May, it's common for me to start getting questions about whether or not to start shortening up our hybrid and variety selection to compensate for the later planting date. In order to make a good decision, we first need to look at how these plants grow and develop. So let's start with corn. Corn grows based off of heat units, or growing degree units. It takes a specific amount of heat from the time you put the corn in the ground for it to reach maturity. So it's understandable to consider looking at an early maturing hybrid when we get to later planting dates. There is, however, more to the story because a lot of these early season hybrids weren't developed to fit into our geography, which could result in a lower yield. And we know that a lot of the later season products that we're used to planting typically result in a much higher yield. So even though we are looking at later than desired planting dates, we do still want to set ourselves up for the best possible outcome moving forward. It's also important to understand that corn will naturally shorten up its maturity as it gets planted later into the season, to the tune of 6.8 GDUs per day for every day planted after May 1st. So what this means is if you take a hybrid and you plant it on June 1st, it's actually going to require 10 less days to reach maturity than if you would have planted the same hybrid on May 1st. So when we look at all of this information put together, my current recommendation is to stick with the plan that you had in place and continue on with the hybrid that you originally chose. Soybeans grow differently than corn and mature based off of the length of night. So regardless of the soybeans' relative maturity, and to the most part when it's planted, soybeans will begin to flower about the summer solstice. What the relative maturity represents is actually the length of time it takes to go from flowering to harvest. And so when you shorten up the relative maturity of a soybean, you actually restrict that plant's vegetative growth and ultimately reduce yield. In contrast, later varieties, planted late, will have a much longer growing season, likely higher yield, and ultimately will have a similar harvest date as that same variety would as if it was planted at an earlier time frame. Again, my recommendation on soybeans at this point would be to stick with your original plan and go ahead and use that variety that you originally had planned to use.